I'm Zach, and I'm a sysadmin. Try not to judge me too harshly for that. I have been doing operations and support kind of things for a long time. I came to London in 2003 and started working as a sysadmin at a company called Vendor, which pioneered software as a service e-commerce. And I stayed there for about 9 years, and that was my really deep technical formative experience, where I was working with development teams and operations teams, and people mostly cooperated most of the time. And then I got sick of it and I left and I started contracting and helped other retailers out in the world. And it was a bit of a shock. Because after going from a very collaborative, feedback-oriented organization, I started to have to manage very transactional relationships with hosting providers and figuring out what it was that I needed and asking them to do something specifically, and it wasn't great. We do have a clicker, good. So after about a year of that, my co-founder Ozzy and I started Akuva. We had the idea that if we focused on hosting one thing instead of hosting everything, we could try to adopt some of the lessons that I learned doing operations for a software as a service company. Because every Magento site is different, but they all start out the same. So there's things that we should be able to figure out there and optimize for. So the point of this talk is going to be trying to share some of the experiences, some of the insights that we've had along the way, because every Magento site, even the best Magento site, can suffer if you're not spending any time thinking about operations. If your site's really good today, it could still get better. If it's not so good today, it could still get worse. If your site's good today, it can still get worse, and it will. Like, things getting better and worse is just par for the course when you're running a site on the internet. So my take on good operations is that it's about providing a basis for continuous improvement. It's about anticipating and planning for failure. And it's about trying to eliminate surprises. Sysadmins have got a really bad reputation for hating change and saying no to things, but really they're just skittish. They don't like things to come out of the blue, because when you hear something at the last minute where you can't anticipate things, that's where you end up tripping up and having problems. So, when I look at a new site, and I think often the first time a sysadmin is going to look at a Magento website, it's when it's already running, there's already been a long development process, the site might have been live for a bunch of time. The first thing that I want to know is everything okay? Is it good? You might ask yourself this question, you might have a business person asking this question, the site might have just been down for half an hour and somebody wants to know, well, are we good now? No matter what situation you're in, there's a set of steps that I go through to try to answer that question. I'm interested in understanding performance of the website, the capacity of the infrastructure hosting the site, and having a bit of a look at the logs, seeing what the website's trying to tell me. It's important to have a handle on these kind of things when the site is stable, because this is going to provide our baseline for continuous improvement. If you know what the site looks like normally, it doesn't matter whether it's objectively good or bad. I don't think there really is an objective good or bad for a lot of questions of performance and functionality. It's what's appropriate and expected for your site. So, basic performance metrics that I look at. This is going to be a bit biased towards Magento 2, because I think we've moved far enough forward in time that we can ignore Magento 1 a bit. The first place that I look is Varnish, because you should be running Varnish. It's pretty lightweight. And it's the piece of the infrastructure which is going to be closest to your customer. So you want to have some idea about what's the volume of requests that you're handling, and what's their disposition. Are they hitting the cache? Are they missing the cache? If you're seeing a large number of cache misses, then maybe something's not right. Maybe it is. You need to understand whether it's normal or not. Past that, the PHP request rate. So of all the things that have made their way through Varnish, what's actually hitting Magento? What's the work that we're giving it to do? What is the response time overall on the site? And something that might seem a little bit strange coming from a sysadmin, but what are the page speed and YSlow metrics? We use GT metrics for this because we can set it up and get an hourly register of what's been happening. But even as a sysadmin, there's a lot of the recommendations for improving the speed of your site that do have infrastructure causes, or you might have done something a bit silly in your development. You might have done something a bit silly in your web server configuration. So getting a take on that is useful. One thing that I will say following the last talk is that a lot of the time, focusing on the recommendations that you'll find as a developer, as a front-end developer, focusing on those recommendations is going to give you a better result than focusing on micro-optimizations on the server. If you can make the server 50 milliseconds faster, that's great, but that is going to be dwarfed by all of the third-party rubbish that you've included for tracking where your leads are coming from. So, on the subject of response time, it's also worth mentioning something a little bit about how you measure that. A lot of systems will give you an overall, here's the response, the average response time, or the average latency for every single request coming through your site. This is not an especially useful metric. In this chart, we see an average response time around about a second. You may think that is good, you may think that is bad. Situationally, both of those things could be true, but it's relatively stable. It's about a second, give or take 20%. But this is the average latency of all the requests. And if we start having a look at some of the other measures, so some of the other averages, the median latency, so this is the point at which 50% of your requests are beneath this level. So we see, the average on the side is 1 second, but 300 milliseconds, half of your requests are coming in under that time, which also implies that you've got a bunch of requests which are taking longer than that time. And sure enough, if we look at the 95th percentile, so this is one request in 20, that's taking 5 seconds. 99th percentile would be a little bit higher. It wasn't interesting on this chart, so I left it out. The point is that you need to have a little bit more nuance in your measurement of your server latency than just saying overall, how's it going? Because Magento, some requests are going to be fast, some requests are going to be slow. If you hit an uncached category page, it's going to be slow. If you're in a checkout and you're waiting for a PSP to come back to you, it's going to be slow. Hitting the home page should be fast. So we tend to use New Relic for getting more detailed performance metrics. This can give us a breakdown by controller, as well as a lot of insight into the back-end metrics. For any reasonably sized Magento site, I think you should be using an APM tool. They're not cheap if you're looking at this starting from a price of free, but compared to developer time, they are an absolute bargain. So if you've got, if you're a developer working full-time on a website, you should have an APM tool. The Redis latency and SQL latency sound like they might be a little bit esoteric. Magento is very chatty. A lot of different page requests will make a lot of database queries, a lot of Redis fetches. If something suddenly starts taking 3 milliseconds when it was taking 1 millisecond, that can easily add half or 1 second into your response time. So that's worth having some sight on. Next, I want to know about capacity. This is the things that if you were thinking of it off the top of your head, as I did, you would write down most of these. Network bandwidth is one which is relevant to you if you're in a cloud environment. You might be using small instances because you don't have a whole lot of CPU requirement or a whole lot of memory requirement. But again, Magento is very chatty. If your network performance is poor, if your bandwidth is throttled, things are going to get really slow, and it's not necessarily going to be obvious why. Getting a good model for your capacity is pretty difficult. So don't try unless you're a really big site and you can spend time doing that. Just try to figure out roughly what to expect. It's useful to know if your web server is generally at 50% CPU during the day or whenever the peak of your daily seasonality is. It's useful to know how much things spike if you do a cache clear. If you're doing a marketing campaign, it's useful to know, like for a typical campaign, how do things change? Again, this is giving you a baseline. It gives you some idea about how much room you've got to move. It will give you some insight if you make improvements and some idea, anticipating Black Friday, what you might want to be doing about that. So the third thing that I look at is having a bit of a look at the logs. This is often an interesting experience with Magento. Magento does have logs. I know there was a lot of wisdom in the past to say just turn them off because they're really slow. As a sysadmin, I think that's terrible advice. It's a good reason to focus on tidying your logs up and making sure that they're not full of rubbish. But it's really important to have some visibility about what's going on and give the application a chance to speak to me, the sysadmin, or you, the developer, wearing the sysadmin hat at 3 o'clock in the morning when the site's down. Having some tools to help you analyze your logs is really useful. If you're in a multi-server environment, you almost certainly want some kind of thing that can aggregate those. The Elk stack is really popular for open source kind of crowd. We use Sumo Logic. It can do all sorts of clever analysis. This screenshot is showing how I pipe the Magento exception log into a function they call log reduce, which does kind of clustering and tries to put things together and gives you an idea about what's the signature in your logs, how many of these different things do you have. But I am a sysadmin, so if you want to do things without logs, you can use your venerable command line tools. One of the nice things about Magento is that, at least for all the core logs, there's a standard log format, there's a standard timestamp which is going to be at the beginning of it, which means it's really easy to just find the first line of every one of your logs and then mangle those to get some kind of summary. And this is the kind of thing you could throw into a cron job. It's the kind of thing that if you're a PHP developer, you're probably looking at that and saying, well, I'm not quite sure what it means, but I'll bet I could make a more readable version in 5 lines of PHP, and you're probably right. If you haven't already done that, do that, stick it in a cron job, get a daily report of your exceptions. Magento System Log is often noisy. I squint a little bit when I'm reviewing these. The critical log lines are ones that you want to pay most attention to. The warning lines are the ones that you're going to look at and say, well, I'm not really worried about that, but what can I do? And I just filter out the info lines. You can focus on trying to make these logs a little bit more useful, and you should. The exception log should be empty. There should be no exceptions on your website, generally speaking. I have yet to find a Magento site where that is the case. So don't panic if you look at this for the first time and you see loads and loads of exceptions, but you do, again, want to try to group those together, have a look and figure out what's normal. If there are things that are coming up in your exception log that are normal, that don't worry you, you should probably be putting a little bit of development effort into fixing that, capture that exception, and do something a bit more sensible with it. This is my favorite Magento 2 exception. This is a critical warning. Obviously, things should not be warnings and criticals. If you're a developer, you might see how a warning got promoted into a critical exception with a 100-line stack trace behind it. But the 2 important things to know here are, number 1, this did not make any measurable impact on the front of the site, and it did cause 10 gigabytes a day worth of exception logs that nobody wanted to read. So pay attention to your logs, clean stuff up. You also want to be paying attention to your PHP error log because there are failures that will happen before Magento can get to them, and if you're only looking at Magento's logs, you're not going to get a full picture of what the problems are. And also monitor for segmentation faults on your servers, because if you create loops in your observers or just have excessive recursion and indexing and things like this, PHP can blow up. It won't be in the PHP log. It won't be in any log. You'll just have an unhappy customer with a blank page in their browser. Make your logs easy to grep. Don't overuse exceptions. They should be exceptional. Critical messages should mean you've got to do something. Don't log things as critical if they're just informational. Don't dump huge objects. I've seen people logging Magento collections, and it's pretty useless. That should never get to production. These days, you should also be concerned about the risk of dumping a bunch of customer data in your logs unnecessarily. Include context. Here is my second favorite Magento 2 log. This is from Magento 2.2. I have changed the name of the payment provider. yes, so this has two log lines. The first saying the PHP error response, and the second one saying wrong transaction status. This is the entirety of what gets logged in this situation, these two lines, so we should be worried because it's a critical message. It's got to do with payments, which is always something that I worry about. But what was the transaction status? What was the change that was happening? Like, what method logged this? What code can I go and look at? Logs, especially critical logs, should not give you more questions than answers. And a quick, would have helped if I put that up on the screen for you. And a quick one, varnish can be configured to write an access log. If you haven't done that, you should. And you can use these extended variables to log whether things are hits or misses and how long they take in microseconds. So do that, makes it really easy to figure out what's causing your cache misses and so on. So that is our audit. The next question is how do we try to make sure that we're keeping things sweet? If you do nothing else, if you have no monitoring on your website at all, set up monitoring for 6 URLs using pingdom, New Relic synthetics, anything. It can be cheap, it can be cheerful. 6 URLs, homepage, cached and uncached, category page, cached and uncached, product, same. If you do that, starting from nothing, you've got a pretty well-rounded look at whether your site is up and running and how it's performing, and you can track that over time. The next question is, how much alerting should we do? And this screen's got a bunch of question marks on it because there is no one-size-fits-all answer. If you're a large organization, you've got dedicated sysadmins, you're probably wanting to be sending pages for a lot of these kind of things. If you are in an agency and you're just working part-time on a site, you probably want to have pages for none of them. You've got to do whatever you've got the resources to deal with. It doesn't make sense to get a bunch of alerts that you are not going to handle because we're all really good at setting up mail filtering rules and then you just won't look at them. So consider using reports instead of alerts. It's better to be checking once a week to see what are the 404s on your website than to get an hourly report that you never look at because it's filtered out of sight and out of mind. I pithily promised one weird trick to improve availability in the summary for this talk. The simple answer for this, super technical, is talk to each other, build a culture of talking to each other, not just within your technical team, but with the people who are doing the content management on the site, with the people who are doing the marketing. So many of the problems that we find on Magento sites are caused by people not coordinating activities, which can be a little bit invasive. If you've got a larger catalog, moving around a top-level category is going to cause a whole lot of indexing. It's going to cause a whole lot of cache clears. If you have somebody doing that while somebody in your finance team is doing a big report, while somebody else is doing a big marketing mail out, your site's going to go down, and it could have been avoided if people just said, hey, planning to do this in half an hour, is that cool? So build a culture of talking to each other. It will go a long way. Similarly, while you're marketing, don't do things which will reduce your capacity. Make sure your URLs and your mailouts are cacheable. There's a lot of temptation for putting unique identifiers in these things. If you do that, strip them out in Varnish, stop Magento from actually seeing them. Make sure that you're still hitting the cache as much as possible. Again, talking to each other, match your demand to your capacity. There's no point doing a huge 80% off sale to 1 million people if you can only handle 500 customers at a time on your website. So work with your marketing people to understand what they can actually do, because nobody wants to throw money away. So, sysadmin's pessimistic. Let's make the best of that. Things are going to go wrong on your website. In this picture, we have 2 things going wrong. You should be able to see at least one of them. We will come back to the other one. One of the things I wanted to put in this talk was to try to give some kind of insight into, across all these Magento sites that we run, what are the common sources of failure and error. And there's a lot of ways that we can categorize this. And they're all useful, but the only categorization that really matters is the errors that are visible to the customer, or the failures that are visible to the customer, the failures that aren't. If a failure is not visible to the customer, you have some responsibility to try to detect and remediate that before they notice that something went wrong, but you've bought yourself some time. So one of the things that you should be doing is embracing the fact that stuff is going to fail, and coding for that, building systems to deal with that. If something is potentially going to time out, like you're making a remote connection, put a connection timeout on it. Make it a fast failure instead of a slow failure. Don't have your checkout connect to a bunch of random third parties. Those are things which are, like, unnecessarily. Those are things which your customers don't need, so do those in a background job. Handle errors gracefully. Second example. Now, we do have two problems here, just as we did in the first one. The first problem is the back-end fetch failed, and the second problem is that we've got a really confused customer who wonders how you broke their computer and why. I'm not going to do shows of hands, but I imagine there's some people who know what a guru meditation is, and it's all well and good, but it's not very helpful. So, customize your error pages. There is plenty of stuff on the internet about how to customize your Magento error pages. It's good. Look at that. Disregard the advice about putting a whole lot of sophistication in your 404 handling. My opinion, Magento's 404 handlers are pretty slow to begin with. And if you have something that spends 5 seconds doing lots of searches, trying to figure out what the customer might want, bad guys can come along and send a bunch of random rubbish to your site and take it off. And sooner or later, somebody's going to make an error in a template, and then everybody who hits every page is going to be generating a whole lot of load on your site. Customizing varnish error pages is really simple, but very poorly documented. The standard module has got this file read thing, so you can actually extract your error pages off into HTML. When I first tried to work out how to do this, I found lots of examples on the internet about inlining all of your error pages in your varnish config, and it's horrific. If you take this approach, it's really straightforward. The catch is, if you are telling Varnish, here's what I want to do with 503 errors from my backends, that's what it's going to do for every 503 from your backend. If Magento sent its own one, it's going to get replaced. You may be cool with that, you may not. You can add more complexity in these functions to not mangle stuff if it's got Magento cookies on it, but do something. Tweak your Varnish configuration, it's really cool. So, we've got our baseline. We've done a look at the site. We know what it looks like normally. We've tried to do some things to help make it a little bit more stable, give us the foundation for growth. I don't have a whole lot of preaching to do about what improvements to make. That's what the other sessions today here have been about, I think. And as developers, it's mostly your responsibility to make stuff better. I'm just trying to pick up the pieces when that doesn't quite work out. But I do have some advice about how we deliver those improvements. I've seen an awful lot of projects doing really fantastic work, having a whole lot of thought go into them, and then they trip over and fall on their faces when it comes to actually delivering the changes into production. So a few tips. First of all, you need to have a staging environment. Any testing between development and production is better than none, but ideally it's going to be something which is the same shape as your production environment. It should have the same moving parts. If you've got replicated databases, you need to do that. If you've got Varnish, you need to do that. The idea here is that on your development environment, probably doesn't look quite like production. You want something which is a little bit closer to do that. You want to be able to sync the data from your production environment. I don't like having customer data in staging environments if I can help it, but there are some things that you're going to be doing where that's necessary. If you are testing a Magento upgrade, Magento 1.1 to 2.2, for example, has got a lot of data migration scripts, and if you test that without any quotes, without any customers, without any orders, it is super fast. It is blazing fast. The upgrade seems like the most painless thing in the world. And if you test that with all of your customer data intact, it can take, literally hours. So sometimes you need to be able to test this, and that means that your staging environment needs to be nicely isolated from the outside world. It shouldn't be able to connect to your production environment. It shouldn't be able to connect to your production payment provider. It shouldn't be able to, upload things into MailChimp. You need to automate a system that lets you pull the, load a copy of your production data in, but not mess things up. Having got a staging environment, you need to spend a little bit of time on planning. This is not the most exciting part of anybody's job, but it's pretty essential. We use a Google Sheet for this so that we can have developers, operations people, business people, all looking at the plan together. We list down every single step, who's going to be doing it, when it needs to happen, and how to actually execute it. If there's a command, it should be a cut and paste command. That includes things like sending messages out to people to let them know that maintenance is about to start, downtime's about to start, running backups, and importantly, figuring out what you're going to do in the case of a rollback. Each of our steps has a check in it. If we have a step to enable the maintenance page, there's a check to get out your mobile phone on a mobile network and make sure that you're seeing the maintenance page. For trickier things along the way, the steps get more complicated. But you should, ahead of time, have figured out, if everything goes wrong, like, what do we do? You want to discuss this with the business people ahead of time. If you're planning a 1 hour downtime for an upgrade, at what point do you say, this isn't working, we should try again? Like, is it like 1 hour in? Is it 2 hours in? It might be half an hour in, because if you've got this plan, you know how long things are going to take. You're going to have some idea of when that's going off track. Having written the plan with your best understanding, actually follow that through on your staging environment, follow it to the letter. If you need to make changes, update the plan, don't improvise, and record how long things actually take. When it actually comes to do the upgrade, do the maintenance, do whatever it is, follow the plan, track the timings along the way, pay attention to when things are going off track, and be prepared to roll back if you need to. Any kind of maintenance or upgrade should be boring. There shouldn't be any surprises. It's like the thing about, lawyers in a court case shouldn't ask any question they don't already know the answer to. You're all smart people and you can anticipate these kind of things. So when you actually get to do your upgrade or your maintenance, it might be 4 o'clock in the morning, you're really tired, you just want to go to bed. You don't want to have to start solving problems. You want to have a clear plan of how you follow things, how you know when you've gone wrong, and how you can get back to your starting point if that happens. After all that, we've executed our plan, we've done our upgrade, we come back to asking the question, are we good? And we go back to the beginning and we look again, what's the performance on the site? Did the performance change the way that you expected? Did you think this upgrade was going to make everything a bit better? How much better? Was it better at all? What do your charts actually tell you? Has the capacity changed? Has your deployment, your great new feature, added 2 AJAX requests on every single page? And so the performance is fairly constant, but suddenly you're using 30% more servers because you've got a bunch more customer requests. And do you see new junk coming up in the logs? So, to recap, good operations, in my opinion, it's about continuous improvement, it's about planning for failure, it's about reducing surprises. If you can do all of those things, even just part-time, even just kick the can down the road a little bit, and every one of your sprints try to do a little bit better, over time you get something which is really stable, really performant, and that you can really be proud of. Thank you. And I think we've got some time for questions.
Do you have anything about sanitizing live data and then putting on staging?
Excellent question. I have mixed feelings about N98 Mage Run. Hands up who doesn't know N98 Mage Run? Cool. Few people. N98 Mage Run, it's available for Magento 1 and 2. It is an all-purpose CLI tool. So this is really useful for Magento 1 that didn't have anything like this. With Magento 2, it kind of shadows some of the bin Magento functionality. One of the things that we do like about it, it has a database dumping functionality that lets you, there's a bunch of canned table groups in there. It knows what tables Magento uses for customers, for orders, for logs, and all these kind of things. And you can create a MySQL dump that leaves all those things out. It puts the tables in, but the tables are empty. You can add a custom list of tables for all your extra extensions, the things that you've done, and have a nice little lightweight sanitized database. So we use that a lot. There are other things that you need to care about along the way. We like to use different Magento crypt keys on production and staging environments so that we don't accidentally have valid production credentials on our staging environment. which would be great if everybody routinely used encrypted values where they should. That often isn't the case. We do use Magento for scripting updates to things as well. So first thing we do when we're preparing a staging environment, do an audit of all the configuration, do an audit of the tables, figure out what we need to be worried about, and then make sure that we've got that done. Did I answer the question? Yeah. If anybody's got any good tools for sanitizing their customer data, because it can be useful to have a full set or the number of customers that you actually have without your real customers' data. I still haven't got a great solution for that, so find me afterwards and talk to me about it.
I think we've got time for one more.
Quick one. So I was told that there is going to be a very nice presentation, but it was really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Question. You mentioned that staging and production environment should be somehow similar, and it would be better for known reasons.
Yep.
What if a client has production environment which has like 10 plus servers?
So I think that it's important to have the same shape, but not necessarily the same size. So there's two ways to think of this. Number one, we only do highly available infrastructure. So we have a separate admin, load balanced web servers, and so on. I think it's really important if you're going to separate your admin and your web servers that you have one of each of those in your staging environment, but you don't need 10 web servers, probably. You may be concerned about things like, does your cache invalidation work properly, and so you need to have multiple things for testing. I think the most, partly this is something you can bring your own understanding of the site, worry about what the risks are. The point of having something which is the same shape is that you don't accidentally find, this works when MySQL is locally on my Magento server, but it doesn't work if I'm connecting over the network. Or this works if I've got my caching turned off completely, but if I start enabling my varnish caching, then things don't get invalidated and I show old carts or stuff like that. So it's important to have not exactly the same number of things, but if you were drawing an architecture diagram, it should be the same for your staging and your production. Doesn't need to run all the time. We don't run our staging environments 24/7. If it's something that you can just spin up when you need it, great. If it's something you do with a bunch of Docker containers, that's probably fine as well. It's the functional concern that I'm worried about.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, everybody.